Welcome, y'all. Welcome to this week's Left Reckoning. David here. Hope that you're good wherever you're at. That was a little jam by Christoph Brun, who does all of our music. Song they wrote for us called "Out of Town." You should definitely check out Christoph's other work too. Just an amazing guitarist and songwriter. um, yeah, I'm happy to be here. We got a few things I'd like to get to, but as always, feel free to jump into the chat with questions. I'm happy to take this conversation really any way that it goes. We got some fun stuff coming up this week. We got Kurt Hackbrow joining us tomorrow to talk about AMLO, who just won a recall election that he called. We'll talk about why the right wing was so adamant about boycotting that. But more importantly, we're going to talk about the shifts that AMLO is trying to pursue in Mexico when it comes to energy policy, something that is oftentimes put into the sidelines when people were talking about AMLO and what's been going on in Mexico. That's actually quite critical. And once you understand the interest of the oil and gas industry in the country, of the private power industry in the country, you'll understand why everything that this guy does is treated with such vitriol. So anyways, we're going to have Kern on to talk about that. And Matt and I just finished recording a conversation that we'll release for patrons on Sunday with somebody who I'm always honored to speak to, Lillian Chichurchia. You should know her work by now, but she is one of the co-hosts of What's Left of Philosophy podcast, which is an excellent show, a philosopher. And she wrote a really great piece for Jacobin on socialism and freedom. So definitely keep your eyes out for that. And, I think we might get into a little bit of France in this stream here. So, look forward to that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about neoliberalism and the Corona crisis and sort of where we're at now, because, we are entering into, 2022. We're 2 years out now. And I've been revisiting some of the work that we were doing on TMBS as it was sort of unfolding. And I figured that might be a nice place for us to sort of start off and launch a conversation on neoliberalism. So I have a clip here that I'm going to play for y'all. I wasn't able to get it all in one, so I might have to jump around this video. But this is something that we did. It was the first week of the COVID pandemic. Later in the video, I'm struggling to remember the terminology they were using, social distancing. So that should give you a clue as to how early we were in the kind of pandemic and crisis. And, we had no idea what was about to unfold in front of us. And I don't know. I just find this to be an interesting clip to see where Michael's mind was at that time. I'll play some of the things that I was saying because, that was such a shift, and people sort of had, and including us, had some hopes that maybe it was going to expose some of the kind of fundamental contradictions of the system that we're living in. And now we can look at, where we're at 2 years later. But why don't I put a little bit of this up for y'all? And, again, feel free. I got the chat up here, so feel free to jump in with any questions or comments that you might want to add to this conversation. But let's get it going. Oh, just for context. So in this clip, Michael's sort of using the metaphor of the hit show at the time, which everybody was watching at the beginning of the pandemic, Chernobyl, to talk about the early phase of the COVID crisis, primarily making the point that, he believed that this should be sort of seen as like the failure of the world system to be able to adequately respond to this crisis. So that's the kind of setup here. And I've cut a little bit further into the clip where he starts to lay out the history of neoliberalism as he sees it. And I think it will be, an interesting little way to jump into this conversation. So enough intro for me. I'll play it now.
Giving mixed information. And then, of course, the whole preceding journey to get here, right? The classic story of neoliberalism, which let's just get really specific about again. Starting in the 1970s, this is a project of political backlash. It's explained in a sort of popular sense of the Keynesian model wore itself out, and we needed to liberalize markets. We needed to make it easier for capital to move around. We needed less regulation and so on. And there's some truth to that. But the other very specific thing that David Harvey points out, and David Harvey really is my kind of guide to neoliberalism as a concept, not just like a buzzword we throw around, is that this is a political backlash, which we can trace to things like the Powell memo. Matt, what's the Powell memo?
I am actually not that great on the Powell memo.
You're not that great on the Powell memo. Anyways,
No.
the Powell memo is a document I think came out in the early 70s. It was a guy who went on to, or late 60s, he would go on to serve in the Nixon administration. I believe he was a Supreme Court pick. And it was basically like, the left is getting too strong. They're getting too strong economically in terms of labor. They're getting too strong in terms of broad social equity, demands, feminism, civil rights movement. We need to counteract this. And so when you think about neoliberalism, you have to think of it as not just this sort of like, this is why distinction making around something just being a natural thing, like the sun sets or rises, versus like politics, which is something we as humans decide, or certain humans decide and other humans don't decide. The rhetoric of neoliberalism, the rhetoric of unregulated capitalism is, this is just a natural force. It's almost like mystical. And we have figured it out, and we have learned to not get in its way. And if we don't get in its way, it will give us a huge amount of wealth. And the truth of the matter is that Thomas Friedman, of all people, was much more honest about it in the 1990s. He said, if you want to succeed, you have to have something he called the golden straitjacket. And the golden straitjacket were the rules of the road for having a lightly regulated, anti-labor, globalized economy. And all of the stuff that goes along with this, attacking labor unions, gutting public health, all of these things, of which the UK has gone pretty far in. No one's gone as far as the United States. And the Europeans, for all of their problems, we're seeing in the last couple of days, they have more basic civilization and decency built in. The French are banning, rent payments and things like that. The Danish have come through with an incredible stimulus and safety program. It's really the United States and the UK, and most extremely the United States, where we are just seeing essentially no response and almost essentially begging Walmart and CVS to figure out a way of getting us out of a global calamity, which threatens so many people's lives and obviously is going to cause extraordinary economic hardship. So what I want to say is that, yes, and here we go. Spain has nationalized all of its private hospitals as the country goes on coronavirus lockdown. So I want us to play, though, with that model of Chernobyl and neoliberalism. And this is the kind of top line thoughts. We're going to be doing a lot more on this on the show, because I actually think, of course, that show was on some sense, kind of crude anti-socialist propaganda. It was also very well produced, very well acted, and terrifying. And of course, again, this isn't a show that's going to romanticize the Soviet Union. So it identified, profound crimes done by the Soviet government of that time. But I want to go on offense, and I want to say, if we took not communism, not socialism, and frankly, this crisis doesn't indict all market activity or all markets. I think we need to actually start to distinguish between.
Yeah, we'll come back to it all in a second. I mean, this is, I want to bring this up because, I don't know, I found it to be an interesting exercise, and I figured y'all might be interested as well to sort of see where, because again, remember, these are like days into the pandemic at this time. And, I think one of the points that we continue to make after this was that state capacity had been so corroded at that time in the US in particular that it really was caught on the back foot. And obviously Trump wasn't really trying to, kick things into gear, especially early in the pandemic, when he was just frankly trying to deny and act like it wasn't happening. But the point about Spain and Europe, I mean, we have the luxury of 2 years of hindsight to see that, a neoliberal model sort of dominated those societies enough that even, for us in America, there might have been a kind of early moments where it seemed like they were reacting, um, at hyperspeed compared to what was happening in the United States. But we know now that their reactions to these were nowhere near adequate either. Um, but I mean, I wanted to go back to this kind of question and frame in here of of neoliberalism and the coronavirus crisis, because we there was a lot of hope, I think. There was a lot of hope, I think, early on, that this was going to sort of expose the fundamental contradictions of this system, and maybe usher in a new era. And what ended up just being a whole host of errors. Because what ends up happening politically after this is, Biden becomes ascendant. This kind of populist left movement in the United States, is completely shut down. The Corbyn movement is very soon after this all completely dismantled and is now run by Capital's favorite boy, Keir Starmer. And there was this kind of hope that, like, okay, well, out of this crisis, can there be opportunity for political movement? And you have to look at the past 2 years in honesty and honestly and soberly, and see that, yeah, how much has really shifted. I mean, the real tragedy of this kind of like world historic um, crisis has actually been, in many ways, that it has sort of allowed a neoliberalism that many people were feeling it might be on its deathbed, to be able to reassert itself, and it hasn't reasserted itself in the same ways. Right? I mean, there's no doubt about it that the state is doing different things now than it was in 2019. Um, but we're nowhere closer, to going back to what Michael was saying, to get the kind of general understanding that, um, the neoliberal logic that these kind of systems are just natural, rational systems instead of imposed, and controlled for the benefit of a few folks. We haven't really broken through all that, and that doesn't mean that there hasn't been progress. But there was this kind of hope that the event itself, the event of the pandemic itself, was going to be able to, to sort of break the stranglehold of neoliberalism. And I think that you can't really look at what's happened in the United States or in the United Kingdom or hell, France, as an example that has really happened. Um, we've seen, and we'll talk about Macron in a little bit, but Macron really is, I think, this kind of poster boy for what neoliberal capitalism, what its next form is going to be, which is pretty harsh austerity on poor and working people, a kind of flirting with, and because Macron really um, prefers to be up against Le Pen, and in that way, she is a sort of perfect foil for him, where it's just going to be a constant kind of assault of the far right against the center, and demand that, yeah, we're not going to give you anything, we're not going to provide for working people, but if you don't show up and support us, then the far right monsters are going to come over and take over the state, and then you'll really be screwed. I mean, that model completely, that was inherited before the coronavirus pandemic. So, like, I think that some things that we have to be honest about is the resilience of this system. I mean, it's still a system that is mired with contradiction, mired with instability, and crisis is always around the corner. But the hope that something outside of a kind of political shift, a material shift, where we have strong working class organizations that are challenging for power, that something is just going to sort of come in and shift and shake the system from the outside. That just has not played out at all. Let me jump forward a little bit, if it's not too indulgent, because I liked what I said here towards the end, and Comrade Michael is informed too. Let's see. Jesus Christ, that's an unfortunate screenshot.
And this system is not equipped to deal with it.
Okay, so this is a little bit later.
I want to say now as we're reminded of how precarious life is, not just because of political and economic systems, but like literally. We all know folks that are old. I know people, very close to me dealing with stuff like evictions. It's evil, it's terrifying, and this system is not equipped to deal with it. And that is not a normative statement, that's an objective statement. And so I want this to be a big ideological point and shift, not just for us to protest and repeat and score points on, but for us to actually sit with the reality of it, that this moment is over. I don't know what comes next. We'll talk about that more. But we're done with it.
I think that what we've been seeing, just almost like on like a psychoanalytic level, of the role of the corporation in our lives in response to this crisis. I mean, the fact that Trump was at the Rose Garden with the CEO of Walgreens and they were using it as an infomercial was definitely like a very frightening thing, and it's very comical. But I mean, open up your inbox. How many people got statements from a myriad of different CEOs? And of course, like, these are massive parts of our economy. So it does matter, what Grubhub is planning to do in response to the coronavirus. I'm not saying that that's not necessarily important, but the fact that there's actually a disconnect between like actually just like kind of public communal spaces that are reaching out to us and this private sphere. And it's been a very weird thing in this what we're calling social distancing moment that we've had over this past few days, to realize that for a lot of people, the communication, the majority of the communication that they're getting is still coming from corporate America and not from communities or families or social organizations. And it really, and that was the neoliberal project too, was to completely socially isolate us. And in a kind of perverse way, on a philosophical level, this is like the perfect crisis of neoliberalism, and that it actually has created us all as atomized individuals, or at least small families that we're stuck in our room. And it's going to be interesting to see. I think I agree with you completely, Michael, that this is a moment that I think it's a reckoning. It should have happened a lot earlier, but hopefully things become clear to people. And I'll talk about this later during the gem. But you'll see that a lot of people are realizing how inadequate our system is at taking care of people. Just going on Facebook, I've been seeing distant family members, people I don't really communicate with that much, really freaking out about the loss of income that's coming, and people are saying, well, how is it that we don't have any access or any kind of social safety net? And it's like, well, obviously this is something
somebody's been telling you, you dumb motherfuckers.
Exactly.
That was a good throwback. Yeah, I mean, and I think that was probably the best clue that we got as to which way things were going to go, right? Was that it was corporate America that was sort of leading the way in the early days of the pandemic. That was the first group that was being asked for, and the first group that was sort of speaking up. And look, I mean, like, there's a lot I think in the fashion of TMBS, we had a lot of optimism that that would expose things to folks. But what we saw after this was just a kind of desire, I think, to put the experts back in charge, and we can litigate how wrong Biden and the Democratic Party and those who have come back into power since the crisis started are. But there's no doubt about that. About the fact that there was a kind of re-legitimization of a kind of neoliberal logic and a kind of just keep the boat going kind of outlook and political worldview post COVID. And I still think that there's a lot of value in pointing out our kind of more fundamental critiques of the system there. But just going back to what I was saying a couple of minutes ago, I think it was a mistake to sort of think that an event like this was just going to sort of shake the foundation of the system so much. And, looking at the history of neoliberalism that survived crisis after crisis, to think that something outside of politics, something coming, out of the, natural world was going to sort of put the barriers on the system, I think was a mistake. And I think take that and hold that in your head for a second, and then look at the next crisis that people talk about a lot, which is the environmental crisis, which is undoubtedly, something that we're facing, something that is serious and something that is real. But there are a lot of people who I think put too much hope in the idea that this system won't be able to incorporate some of the bare minimum things that might help alleviate some aspects of this crisis into their program. I'm much more worried. There was a long time the left wing slogan was, there is no solution to climate change under capitalism. There's no solution to climate change under neoliberalism. And certainly that's true in the case in the sense of, will the solution be more equitable? Will the solution be safer? Will the solution allow working people to thrive? That's true that it won't be able to provide avenues for that. But this system is very, very reflexive. And we're already starting to see an embedding of a kind of green neoliberalism. I think Macron really represents this, where it will be upon the poor and the working people to pay for the for some level of solution to the crisis. It will be dominated by market logic. So basically making transportation, powering your home more expensive to try to curtail use, right? Rather than reforming our economy, or radically reforming our economy, to pull power away from the people who benefit and profit from the destruction of the planet and the destruction of our ecosystems. It will be upon working people to pay the costs, and it will be paid by them not just in the immediate sense of higher taxes and money, but in a forced austerity to lower people's standard of living. And I think that if you're on the left, that's something that you should be very, very worried about. And I don't see, unfortunately, enough preparation for what that's going to look like. I think a lot of people, when they see any kind of form of action, because they've been used to a few decades of what has frankly just been complete inaction, they think, well, maybe it's not as progressive as we would like, but this is a good thing. I'm going to tell you right now that, until we start preparing ourselves to sort of wrest power away to build up our capacity as a working class movement, things have the potential to get a hell of a lot worse, and there will be action. But it will not be in the benefit of the vast majority of people. And that could be a real, real setback for the left. If we don't start to make our claims and criticisms of people like Macron, of this kind of growing green neoliberalism, if we don't make those critiques more apparent and accessible, to the vast majority of the population, we could get ourselves into a lot of trouble. One, because of the forced austerity of the kind of center neoliberal movement that is looking and wishing to sort of use these kind of claims that, oh, it's an individual responsibility. Oh, you need to just drive less. Oh, you shouldn't live so far away from your job. All that kind of logic. I think that they're very willing to pursue that. And what's going to come out of that will, one, be austerity, if those are the powers that win, and two, more continuation of this extremely dangerous game that centrists and neoliberals have been playing, with sort of completely squashing any kind of political avenues for left-wing movements, or even just kind of like nice, simple, social democracy in any of these countries, completely squashing that to the benefit of the far right, to the Le Pens, to the Trumps. And this shit could get a lot worse, which is hard to even wrap your head around sometimes, because it's already really bad. But I don't know. I think that looking back at what we were saying, then is interesting. I'd like to do more on that. I mean, I know we got a lot of hate for this, but I think we were right. Was taking seriously people's worries that they weren't getting paid or taken care of during this crisis. Obviously the right wing was trying to utilize that anger, for their own kind of, suicidal political project. But I also think that there was a big mistake on the left to not sort of be able to be out there saying, like, no, we should be getting money every month from the government. I mean, what ended up happening was too little, but it was extremely popular, what came out for Trump. And that's had major consequences for politics all across the country, let alone right here in Texas. Biden's continued refusal to sort of make good on his very basic bare minimum promises on stimulus, on canceling student loans, on getting more relief to working people. It's already a kind of buckle up, bucko, message that we're getting from the Biden administration. I think electorally that will be a disaster, but more importantly, on a human level, on a material level, we're facing something that's quite dangerous, and it has been a real resurgence of something that we thought was on its last legs. But let me see. I'm happy to go and take some questions in here if y'all have any thoughts. There's a little bit at the end of the clip that I'd like to play. It's just a funny thing. Cameron wants to ask me a question about Canada, and I'll admit, I'm no real expert. I'd love to get Luc Savage on the show again sometime soon, or some of our other comrades from up in Canada to sort of help break down what's going on there. But the NDP, from my understanding, has been able to pull out some concessions from the Liberal Party. Unfortunately, it's far cry from what would be enough. Details are depressingly vague and may invite some further corporatization. I'm trying not to be too pessimistic. Yeah, I would like to, to have somebody who's a little bit more knowledgeable about what's going on, with the deals of, the power agreement there, the details. Sorry, but it's tough, and it's amazing too. The Liberal Party in Canada's, willingness to sort of pursue a policy of bare minimum politics, because you're seeing in the United States and you're seeing in Canada that sort of new formations, and I don't know if they're strong enough to become popular formations yet, but new formations are starting to emerge, and you should take those threats seriously. I think a lot of people sometimes for example, the Triker convoy stuff. I think a lot of people overstate how large and embedded they are amongst people. But there's no doubt that there's something novel happening. And this shit festers when political horizons have closed, right? Le Pen exists because political horizons in France have closed. Trump existed because political horizons in the United States have closed. The far right movements in Canada exist because political horizons are closing. I can't. Again, I'm no expert on what's going on with the NDP and Singh there, so I don't want to talk too much out of class. But there's certainly a need for something something much more class rooted than class focused, across all of these kind of the English speaking left countries for sure. We have a friend, Mahmoud Hussein, who says, I live in the UK and I'm a final year medical student. Well, thank you for looking out for people. I should be working in the NHS later this year. The NHS has almost been destroyed by cuts. It's very sad. Absolutely. And, it's one of those things that I think a lot of people thought that they weren't going to be able to touch the NHS as much as they have. And this is exactly what fucking happens too in the British context, when you have a Labour Party that is so anti-worker, that is so anti-internal democracy, that they are willing to lose elections to make sure that their party stays friendly to capital. They will allow Johnson and the rest of the Tories to completely gut these social programs, which should be the pride and joy of a party like Labour. It's dark shit, and I'm not trying to be doomer. I know I'm coming off a little dour today. There's a hell of a lot of exciting things. The labor movement in this country feels much more invigorated than it's been at any time in my lifetime, or at least times that I've been following or watching these things closely. There are counter movements to this, but I really, really want to remind folks that we just cannot handle, more decades of this kind of, backseat left-wing movement where we just sort of make our critiques amongst ourselves and watch these kind of centrist forces, or frankly the right-wing forces at this point, continue to pave the ground for these kind of right-wing reactionary movements to be successful. And they won't, the right-wing movements won't be successful every time, but if the flip is kind of neoliberal management of the economy and a preservation of the interest of corporate power over everybody else in society, that then flips every few years to, kind of right-wing movement that completely dismantles as much as they possibly can in the period of time that they're in power. I mean, that is a kind of, we're on the edge of a cliff politically right there. And I get worried because I see so many people like resorting to thinking and talking about politics, people who are really invigorated by the Bernie movement, the same way that they were maybe talking about politics in 2014. We have to be very serious about returning to the roots of the left and the socialist movement. And that means, continuing to embed yourself in your community, and in your class and with your coworkers, and not just sort of being the junior partner who doesn't even get to speak, of the Democratic Party or of these kind of centrist neoliberal formations, because they are setting ourselves up for this kind of constant cycle of right-wing reaction, and then management, and then neoliberal management of decay. Ricky says, I've had multiple hour-long conversations with coworkers over the years. People are convinced we are powerless. I don't know how to convince them that we have collective power. I feel like that's key. I 100% agree with you. It's just a quote that I like so much, from Ronan Burtonshaw, who we interviewed on TMBS, I think, just a couple of weeks after that clip of Michael that we just played. But he made the point that, like, the job of socialists, is to convince working class people that politics can change their lives, for the better. And what happens after that in the UK is things get worse, right? So it makes the challenge almost more difficult to meet. But I mean, if I were in the US, I would point to the success of the successful unionization effort at Amazon, the continued victories for Starbucks, the backbone of the working class. I mean, I'm thinking about Warrior Met right now. That hasn't ended in victory, but you want to talk about an inspiring story, or people who have now stood out over a year, fighting and demanding fair pay, and the wages that they rightfully deserve, right? Like, that's courage, and that's inspiring too. I think looking towards those kind of examples are going to be much more beneficial, than sort of putting up kind of hypothetical, electoral victories, that you think could happen. I mean, you have to show people that being active, gets the goods, because it does. And we have to beat. I've called it what I call left pessimism before. This kind of depression that leftists find themselves in, where they look out the world, they see that it's really bad. But remember that socialism is an inherently optimistic philosophy, in my opinion. It says that out of all of this shit, something good is possible. That despite our alienation and the exploitation that we experience on a daily level, we have the capacity and the ability to build something up better. And I think pointing to examples of that you're seeing in your community is probably the best way to motivate people, and also remind them that it doesn't get better until we start being more confident in flexing our muscle. I mean, it was scary to go up against Bezos and Amazon. They spent millions of dollars trying to shut down that campaign, right? That was not a shoo-in, but it took the kind of confidence and the courageousness of a few people that then became many. And that's where you sort of have to live, up here, if you want to be able to maintain yourself for this kind of long fight. I've not seen this. This is from Twitch. Have you seen the GOP infighting over food shortages caused by Abbott's border stunt? I haven't, but I would love to read up more about it. I'm working on a big piece on Abbott right now, so that'd be really helpful if you could send it that way. I'm just trying to get down to the bottom here, but keep those questions coming. I'm going down. I think we're talking about Canada here. I'm always flummoxed as to why dental is included as basic healthcare. I assume it's some kind of crazy conspiracy of dentists. I mean, it just shows that wherever a for-profit system is able to carve itself out in things that undoubtedly just need to be complete public goods. You will get not only bad results, but kind of bizarre results. Yeah. I mean, why are your teeth not considered to be a part of your body? It's unbelievable. And I think most reasonable people recognize it as absolutely insane that it's not included. And it's only just sort of feeling that it's a natural progression rather than a deliberate choice to deny certain people access to dental care. I think really kind of dispel this kind of natural mythology of the way that the world is, instead of something that's been deliberately done to you and the members of your classes, is a very viable and important way to start to frame these things and think about them. What happens if Le Pen wins? I mean, it would be extremely damaging and dangerous for working class people. This would be an increase in violence. You'd see, I mean, I can't sit here and say with complete knowledge what the future would look like, but it'd be very bleak. But never forget that the reason that we're facing this threat again is this kind of the failure of the Socialist Party in France, and that started with Hollande, taking this devil's bargain and the complete defanging of these left parties in Europe. I mean, the Socialist Party is a complete joke in France, and they sowed the seeds of Macron's rise, and through Macron of Le Pen's possibility of coming in and doing pretty extreme damage in a major country, massive population. I mean, it would be extremely damaging to see Le Pen come into power. There's no doubt about it. The thing is that the middle class and the upper class people will be fine, and they'll wag their fingers at the left and at these other kind of more liberatory movements for not showing up for somebody like Macron, who has made it very, very clear that he wants to wage war on working people. That's a politically, is a truly predictable and disastrous, potential outcome there. I'd love to see this too. My new coworker just randomly brought up unions, and now we were best buddies. Well, hell yeah, keep that going. I mean, that's how it all started. I mean, remember, some of these shop floors that Starbucks is organizing is a few people. I mean, you can really build personal relationships in some of these places and get a pretty impressive victory. It's from Twitch talking about what's going on with Abbott. The ad commissioner has tweeted about how Texas is going to lose jobs and commerce due to truckers avoiding Texas as a point of entry. It's trending on Twitter. All right, well, I'll definitely be checking that out. Well, let's see. I'd be happy to take a couple more questions. Let's see. I have something fun. Let me share this with y'all real quick. While y'all are sort of loading up maybe a couple more questions before I roll. I don't know. This just made me laugh here. This is from the same clip towards the end, because this was the first you could even see. We were still on Zoom. We were still learning how to make that work. And I don't know. I just thought this was a funny kind of ending to this clip here. Also, look at Matt, man. Short hair Matt. Remember, y'all, he copied me. Let's bring this up.
1000%. But don't get used to this either. Because I think David, you're completely right. I mean, in the sense that I'm talking about, in terms of public health, in terms of systems collapse, in terms of human life, this is a distillation that this whole model is a catastrophe for human well-being and we need to stop, right? Mm-hmm. And from the perspective of the neoliberal model,
he freezes. This was just
let's
like
have
what we were
people
dealing
that we've
with.
Already, have decided aren't really human anyways.
And then Emma comes on
to
unannounced
to come get us our our food. Did Emma just jump on?
She just joined us. Yeah.
Emma,
I didn't even realize that I could, once I click join, that I would just be on air.
Well, welcome.
Emma's like, I'm not waiting.
Hey guys, keep
Hey, Emma.
doing what you're doing.
You just watch.
Oh man, it was a lot of fun. It was a fucking weird ass time, but we made do. I mean, that was like 3 days into the stay at home order. Anyway, we watched. If people just joined us, we watched a good chunk of that video, just sort of revisiting what Mike was saying, what our early response was to the coronavirus pandemic, and how sort of framing it in neoliberalism was fun. But I figured it was worth sharing that because I think it's funny, especially knowing that Emma ended up joining up at a Majority Report soon after that. Actually, it's a very funny one. Michael and Emma got a huge fight after that about Elizabeth Warren, which that's a throwback for sure. Well, let's see, y'all. I'd be happy to take a couple questions before I roll. Our friend, I've been talking to our patrons about something we want to do sometime in the near future. We're cooking on it. I don't know if it's going to be coming necessarily very soon, but we want to do something on this thing. What are you thinking of looking into with your Australian show? I mean, this is from Radium Theater Productions. It's good to hear from you. But, I mean, with Australia, I think that it would just be helpful to help people have a little bit of a better and deeper understanding of the kind of political outlook in the country, the state of labor in the country, recent history. Because I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of focus and talk. Like I can talk through, what's been going on in UK politics for the past 10 years with most folks. But Australia, other than a kind of very, very surface level understanding, I don't have as strong of a grasp on the country. So I'd love to, be able to do more on that. And I also think that, my understanding is at least culturally, and maybe I'm mistaken on this. I think that there's, a lot of similarities and a lot of pretty significant differences between the U.S. and Australia. And I think that, I don't know, it's a bit of a shame that it's not, at least on my end, hasn't been explored as much as it should. So that's the general hope. Did y'all see the Giga Rodeo, Elon Musk's thing in Austin last week? Musk just like fucking dime store cowboy get up, just looking awful. Created this extremely dystopian festival to celebrate his strange little trucks. They disrupted the local school system in Del Valley, and kids had to go home early. Parents were sort of struggling to get daycare and things like that for their kids, all to placate the ego of this guy who has no real connection or interest in the state of Texas, other than dressing himself up in $150 Stetson, to go and, be adored by the biggest group of dweebs that we've ever seen converged in one place. Matt and I are going to spend some time looking through some of the darker images that were released. They had a kind of cyber bull modeled roughly on the famous one on Wall Street. They had very weird kind of they had like mechanical bulls for people to ride, and just very strange decor. Y'all know the political critique of this guy, but I think we might spend a little time breaking down aesthetically what the fuck is going on over there too. Someone asked me, Forktail says, do you think the way racist neo-Nazis call themselves socialists is on purpose to malign actual socialists? Well, I mean, historically, the Nazi movement did that because they saw that there was a rise in popularity for, socialism. So they wanted to attach their brand and their movement, to it. I've just been alerted by text messages from a good friend of mine, Matt. I won't say his last name. I don't know if he wants people to know him, but that it is worth noting too that the bull at Musk's cyber rodeo also didn't have any balls, which I think is a pretty good metaphor for that whole movement. Let's see. Am I a fan of the Western Australian psychedelic pop scene? I can't tell you I know too much about it, but are you an expert, Strom? I'd be happy to learn. All right, I'm coming through these questions right quick. I don't know what this is, Comrade MDR, but I'll read it for Australian fans. You can go on a tweet war with Barnaby Joyce. It's the Australian way. Sure. I don't like comic books. I never did. I'm sorry. I hate to disappoint folks. I didn't like. I mean, the last superhero movie that I think I earnestly saw with any kind of excitement was like the first Spider-Man in the early 2000s. But I was never a big superhero person. I liked Star Wars and Lord of the Rings when I was a kid, but I was never really into superheroes. Which means there's not much to see. Oh, is Barnaby Joyce is he the kind of blonde guy? I only know him from the weird ass shit that he says. Let me see. I can't share audio right now. I'm trying to finally figure out my setup, and I keep on like getting close and then changing it. No, Bob Gator's the guy who I know of. Who is I've been told is a real pig, but he's the guy who got egged. What are your thoughts on long COVID and whether some kind of government intervention is needed at this point with all the new variants popping up? I mean, I'm not a medical expert, so I can't talk too much about long COVID, and I don't think it's helpful for me to talk about that kind of stuff. But I mean, there's undoubtedly a lot more that needs to be done, just socially and politically, to help people get back on their feet. I mean, the most popular program in this country that we've seen in our lifetimes was sending those fucking checks, and I think that that's desperately needed, especially as people are suffering through. The crisis of rising prices, which can only be understood as a capitalist class understand that has the capability and the ability to raise prices and to sort of squeeze out any gains that labor saw over the past few years. I think finding ways to continue to support people, specifically people on the lower end of the wage spectrum, who were able to, because of the, relatively small, but for most working people, meaningful amount of money that they got, were able to start to deny and reject unfair working conditions and to demand more. What's worrying is if inflation really does take hold, that wage gains that we've seen will be completely overrun by inflation. So economically, there's a hell of a lot more that can be done. I think that continuing to be able to send people testing is needed. I think that is a travesty, a complete travesty, that we're seeing the government say that it's not going to pay for uninsured people, access to testing and things of that nature. I mean, that's so dangerous. I mean, I was uninsured at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and I needed that, and I couldn't imagine being in a situation right now where we're having contact regularly with folks. I mean, just frankly, here in Texas, it's been open for a long time. I know that's not the case everywhere else, but if you're increasing your contact with people to not be able to take a test to make sure that you're safe, it's worrying. I mean, like, look, if I'm worried that I've gotten exposure, if I'm worried that I still haven't caught it, thank God. But, if I'm worried that I'm, might have been exposed, or if I know that I might be seeing somebody who I would like to be absolutely sure that I'm not carrying the virus, I'm constantly in this position where I'm worried, should I waste the test to test myself, because I know that I have a dwindling number, with me in my household, and the price for these things have just gone up astronomically. I mean, that's something that there's no doubt of. They should have done the first fucking day of the pandemic, and it's ridiculous that we're 2 years in and they're still, incapable of providing them. And like the initial delivery to households from the government um, through the USPS, really worked well. And there's no reason why this, people shouldn't be able to get more tests delivered and on a regular basis. Because we can't be in a situation right now where you're not able to get tested. There's no doubt that there's still more that can be done. I think I'm more interested in doing more socially for people, to allow people the kind of freedom to interact in the world in the way that makes them feel most comfortable, and is safest for them and their family. And the government has completely given up on doing anything like that. It's as I said earlier, it's a buckle up bucko message that we're getting um, from the Biden administration. Okay. Rob asked me a question, but I don't really understand it. So if you want to rephrase it, I could maybe give it another go, but that doesn't make too much sense to me. All right, I'm looking. Zachary, will you, Matt, cover the results of the French election with Mélenchon getting close to the second round? Is that good or bad for the left in France that he was close? I mean, it's great for the left that he was close. I think it's without a doubt at this point that it's time for the French left to sort of incorporate itself and to mobilize itself around that project. I mean, they increased their vote share from 2017. It is probably the most viable, challenge to the current status quo. We're looking at, a small fraction could have made the difference there. That we'd be talking about a much happier result, which would have been Macron versus Mélenchon. There's no doubt about it that if anything, is the most viable movement for the left wing in France. And I think, it just goes back to the way, we've talked about this in other cases. But we're a kind of nitpicky left was so focused on sort of showing that they were more aware of Mélenchon's flaws than the capability and the capacity to sort of carry up a broad left-wing movement to challenge entrenched austerity and neoliberalism in the case of Macron, and far right reaction in the case of Le Pen. I think it's a real shame. I mean, the Socialist Party there is completely dead. The Green Party, I think, needs to get in line there if they're serious about dealing, with the environment in any kind of serious way that also does not create mass kind of economic disenfranchisement for everyday working people. Mélenchon had the most viable, in my opinion, program there. So I think it's good in the sense that like there's momentum and there's growth there. It's obviously bad in the sense that 5 years now till another kind of presidential challenge can be made, but there's plenty that can be done in the meanwhile. And I think it shows that there's that's one of the last of the big kind of left populist projects that's left. And I think there's a lot of problems with left populism as a philosophy, and it was an interesting era, the Bernie, the Corbyn, and Mélenchon movement. And I've done a lot sort of breaking down that history. But that's the last one that is at least viable that could sort of maybe grow into something else. So I don't know. I mean, it's bad that he lost. It's good that they're more successful than last time, and that hopefully that momentum can lead to better results in the near future, right? Thick COVID. It's a good question from Harpreet Chima. I hope I pronounced your name right. If I was wrong, I apologize. But do you think this is a good question? And I'll just say up front, Leo Panitch talks a lot about this. Do you think progressives in office need to be more open with supporters about what is happening in Congress? It's a black box to the ground activists. Meanwhile, lobbyists are in the building. So Leo Panitch, there's a God, Lord in heaven. I've had a weird long day today, but so forgive me if I'm getting this theory wrong, but there is a theory called like the iron law of like oligarchy, and it's sort of a way of expressing what has happened to social democratic or even socialist parties once they have been incorporated into the state. And the way that that is oftentimes presented is that, well, a politician who is like a representative of the working class, and more often than not, genuinely so, gets catapulted into power, but not with enough of mandate to overtake state power. And they spend time in the government. And when they're in government, this is loosely paraphrasing Panitch's framing of it, they realize in his terms, that the enemies don't have little horns on their head. That actually some of the members of the established parties actually are nice guys, and they go out to dinner and they socialize and they interact with people, and there becomes a disconnect between the actual experience of working people who they're supposed to represent and their like lived life, their actual life living in the big, capital of the country that they're at, going out to dinners and things like that, where they start to lose the desire to overthrow the system and rather to sort of manage and to provide some benefits to their people. And there's a lot of debate over how true this is, and I don't want to get into it right now. There's a really great long piece sort of breaking down the history of that in Jacobin that y'all can find. The author's name is escaping me right now. But the point that you're making here about progressives in office needing to be more open with supporters about what is happening in Congress is crucial, not just on a kind of political level of, oh, I'm sending updates and people know that I'm working very hard for them. Every politician does that. But it's the institutional knowledge. And I think that that's one thing that is most missing across like the broad left in the most general sense. And more importantly, within our growing like socialist movement is understanding how the state operates. I'm telling you right now that, AOC has probably gotten a crash course in how decisions are actually made, where power is located, how you're able to get things done. That is a knowledge that she holds. That activists, even if they spend a lot of time reading theory and history and things like that, they don't have it. And this is a point that Panitch makes, is that one of the big crises that ends up happening when you have, elected officials of the working class movements in office is that because they realize, he also makes the point too that like typically like labor politicians, not the party, but like people who come from those movements, they tend to stay in office a long time and enjoy a lot of popularity because they're the tribunes of working people. But what often happens is they realize that if there's a lot of knowledge sharing, then the commitment to them, like just them as an individual, is weakened, right? So there is an actual decision to actually keep this knowledge that you're gaining for yourself. And to not be sharing that kind of understandings of the inner workings of the state and how power is operating and who's holding it, etc. From the kind of more activist base, from the kind of more rank and file base. And that is a really, really, really devastating development because it keeps a lot of us in the dark as to what's actually happening. But two, it does not allow us to give ourselves the capacity to understand the state apparatus and the way that the state functions. And it's to our detriment in the long-term movement because it doesn't allow us to find those kind of pressure points for how we can start to get more of our demands met in the near future. And again, this is not like unique just to like the current moment in the United States. This is a kind of crisis that has happened from social democratic parties and even socialist labor parties the world over. And that is something that needs to be a major demand if we want to kind of break that cycle and that chain. I know it's really can seem tedious and boring, but I do think that if you are somebody who is watching this and like, spends time trying to read, theorize, and understand these systems, I think spending more time with state theory and dealing with the state as a as a as a as a system and thinking about it materially is something that has been missing from a lot of kind of left analysis, because a lot of left analysis is solely focused on the electoral in the most basic way and saying, like, how can we build a coalition that can win an election? And that's a hell of a lot of that's a very important thing. I'm not saying that's not an important thing at all, but the real moment where these movements get crushed or they get incorporated or they fail is once you enter into the state. That's where the radical, revolution really begins. And, and that goes from, people who, a kind of electorally minded movement versus maybe a more revolutionary movement. Understanding how the state operates is absolutely critical if you want to be able to deliver for people. So I think that's um, a really important point. I think that knowledge sharing is really important for the longevity of the movement. And I think that, re-upping that would be very important. Can the U.S. support social democratic programs without leaning very hard on imperialism, neoliberal exploitation abroad? Yes, but there is no promise that because the United States is pursuing social democratic programs, for example, at home, that it will give up the empire. Like, the empire is not necessary to produce social democratic programs. I really disagree with that kind of framing. There's a lot of wealth that is in the United States because of exploitation, because of the way that capital flows globally, and that is maintained by the United States, imperial system. But it is not a necessary condition to be able to produce and provide, kind of basic, social programs for people. In fact, you could do even more than kind of basic social democracy without needing the empire. We have the capacity through labor, and there is tremendous amounts of resources, both internally and globally, that can be used to create abundance. The empire is not, designed to sort of fatten up the working class or to placate the working class. The empire is designed to increase the power and the wealth of the people at the very, very top of the society. And any kind of benefits that are sort of thrown your way that are directly associated with America's like imperial ambitions are just ways to try to incorporate people into that system, but it is not necessarily a precondition for those, if that makes sense. And I think a lot of people who rightfully are anti-imperialists fall into this really bad trap of making it seem that if you want to pick, you have to pick between abundance for working people in the United States and globally, or ending imperialism. That's a dead framing. That is a framing that will fail, and it's a framing that's frankly incorrect. That's a good question. So I'm trying to read through the questions. I appreciate everybody. Yeah, definitely rest in peace, Leo Panich. Leo Panich is somebody worth spending some time reading. I have been getting through his book. It's been a little while since I read it. The book he wrote with Sam Gindin on the making of global capitalism, which is absolutely fascinating and phenomenal. I think should be a fundamental text for where we need to go. All right. I'm going to answer this. I'm just going down a couple more. I appreciate everybody coming by. What do you think about the emerging multipolar world and the complete erosion of the dollar system? Well, I've answered this question a few times. I will say that a lot of the kind of jubilation and people who are thinking that we're seeing the end of the dollar system happening immediately right now is a little premature. there's no doubt that things are trending in this way, and what's happening with Russia has only accelerated that, because countries want to be able to dictate their own activities, rightly or wrongly, in the sense of like, what Russia's doing is absolutely barbaric. But I'll tell you right now that like China is not as people think that just, okay, something is a world reserve currency, and they're like, well, that's the best thing. Like, that's what you want. And it's not true, because while you get an incredible amount of power that comes with that, the United States has used that to its own benefit. There also are tremendous amounts of responsibility and constraints that come with that, mainly keeping your currency extremely stable. Right. And that is one of the requirements that the United States basically has to follow, which means on the macro level that there are certain kind of monetary policies that you are limited in your ability to follow through with. And, the United States has a tremendous advantage because global capital re-enters the American system. Think about the investments that are made in America through the stock market, through property, things like that, even profits that are completely produced in another part of the world. They're elite. They come, they take those profits in dollars and they bring them to the United States. That basically reincorporates them in the American system. So I'm not saying there aren't tremendous benefits with being the reserve currency, but China has not wanted to put itself in this kind of position because it wants to have the ability to mess with its own currency so that it can pursue its own internal and even external economic operations and funding operations. So I just want to remind people of that like China's very reluctantly, entering into that kind of an arrangement. I just think understanding that from the baseline will help you sort of understand what's going on. What do I think about the emerging multipolar world? I mean, look, I'm a socialist. I'm much more interested in the development of working people's power of all nations, and globally. There's no like, what do I think about it? I guess is a different question than what I feel about it. What I think about it is it means that the capability and capacity of the American state to basically be able to get its way globally is diminishing, and that's going to have pretty significant consequences. But I do warn people about being too premature and thinking that kind of system is over. All right. Let me see. I might be rolling in a second, but I'll see if I'll maybe take one or two more questions. How about that? Scroll to the bottom, see if we got any people. These are always fun though. I always appreciate chatting with y'all. Nicholas says, would it be cool to make an online course on leftist organizing and Rev? I figured it'd be take what I learned from you, Matt, and Richard Wolff. It'd be democratically run. That sounds great. Definitely go for it. All right. Yes, this is a very important point from Jeffrey. Leo talked about this too. The dollar system won't be completely eroded for a long, long time. No one else has the infrastructure to replace it at this point. Yeah, and I just think people need to recognize that, because again, as I said earlier, people think like being like having that position in the global system isn't necessarily something that, for example, like China might be envious of. I'm sure they're envious of some of the capabilities and capacities that come with it. But I also think that there's an understanding there of some of its limitations. And most importantly, the infrastructure, I think, is a very important bit. So last question, I think. is from Davos, who says, how do you explain to people who identify as communists but regard doing politics as a sort of perversion, a bit counterintuitive? No. Why is there no vision of power? I mean, I'm much less interested in how people personally identify in politics these days. I think, um, you know, so much of politics, the way that it's been done and we're sort of taught to think about it in this country, particularly with the extremely weak and unorganized left, is it becomes a kind of individual action. And rather than a kind of, you building up an understanding of the world in order to change it in the kind of Marxist way, right? This Marxist line. It's a focus on how can I express myself and my distaste and distrust with misery that I see around me. And I understand the desire for that on a personal level, but that doesn't get the ball rolling at all. I mean, politics is the question and movement of people. And if you consider yourselves to be a communist or something of that nature, and you're not interested in people, then I think that you might be a little bit mistaken about your own kind of personal political beliefs there. All of throughout history, communists have been very interested in politics, coming from Marx all the way to Lenin. I mean, read Lenin in 1905. Do you think he was just sitting on the sidelines and, and complaining about bourgeois institutions? He was criticizing what was happening, but he was also seeing social movements and political movements uprising around him to challenge the monarchy. And to start to build some kind of semblance of clawing back power away from a very, very aristocratic and authoritarian state. And he saw that these movements were very important. He, of course, wanted to take them to their next logical step, which was emancipation for people. But, he wasn't somebody who was just willing to sit these things out. And I don't know. I think a lot of the people who are really online about this, it's an identity rather than an ideology. It's an identity rather than a political movement. And I think sooner or later, it's like you gotta be involved in politics in a material way rather than just in a kind of intellectual way. And I think that that's been one of the bigger mistakes of a lot of lefties in this country for a while. All right, y'all. I appreciate everybody hanging out with us. Tomorrow we're going to be joined by Kurt Hackbrath, who's going to be talking to us about AMLO and what's going on in Mexico, particularly why the U.S. is so angry at AMLO for trying to pursue a very, very modest reprioritizing of energy production in favor of everyday people rather than the kind of profit interests of the few. It'll be a really interesting conversation this weekend. People liked some of the stuff we were talking about just a few minutes ago. We had a conversation with Lillian Chechirchia, who is absolutely excellent, who's co-host of What's Left of Philosophy. She also writes pieces for Jacobin as a philosopher as well, on socialism and individual freedoms, socialisms and liberal freedoms, and sort of challenging the idea that that socialism is against these things, which is absurd on its face, and two, that these things came out of capitalism, when in fact, it has been these kind of radical movements that have really brought into play a lot of these freedoms that are worth defending. So I hope that y'all join us for that. And as always, I'll see y'all tomorrow. Feel free to reach out with any messages or things or suggestions or things that you want us to cover in the near future. I'm always happy to hear from y'all. Take care.